Hi everyone and good afternoon. You're very welcome to the fourth session in the Research Toolkit, the UCD Library Research Toolkit for PhD and graduate students. My name is Jenny O'Neill and I'm the data manager with UCD Library. So I'm going to talk you through data management planning this afternoon. I'm joined by my colleagues Vanessa and Dermot, who are going to monitor the chat, make sure I don't miss any questions. And they'll also be sharing some relevant links as we go through the webinar and admitting people as they join the room. The meeting is being recorded, so you should have seen that pop up on your screens. If you do not want to be included, just turn off your mic and stay muted, and then you won't show up on any subsequent recordings. If you have any questions at any point, just pop them into the chat. And I'll either answer them there and then, or I'll get back to you at the end of the session. So I want to start by asking you what school you're in, just to get an idea of the audience that we have today. So if you just pop into the chat what school you're in. So this will give me an idea of the range of disciplines that are here today. Okay, huge range of different ones, which is great. It's great to see so many different people engaging with this this series. So medicine, social sciences, medicine. I saw engineering, education, psychology, nursing, biology, architecture. I'm pretty sure history, agriculture, biosystems, physiotherapy. I'm pretty sure we've covered pretty much all of the disciplines from all across campus. So it's great to see such a range of people with a range of disciplines joining the webinar this afternoon. So what we want to try and avoid, this is kind of like the worst case scenario that we really want to try to avoid. So imagine 3 years after having completed your PhD, a researcher in your field calls to verify the integrity of the data you collected because they think it may be flawed. Do you know where your data files are 3 years later? Were they stored properly in a location that you can still access? Have any of the files been corrupted in the last couple of years? And are they in usable, shareable formats? And almost most importantly, did I mute myself? I'm terribly sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Jenny.
Okay, great. Yes. What happened there? But okay, good. You can hear me. So do you have proper documentation about how you created, analysed and made use of your data that still makes sense to you and to other researchers? So I'm going to start with a couple of definitions just to help us think about the research and the data that we're collecting. So this is a definition that I quite like. So it says research data means documents in a digital form other than scientific publications, which are collected or produced in the course of scientific research activities and are used as evidence in the research process or commonly accepted in the research community as necessary to validate research findings and results. So there's a couple of things I want to pull out here. So really when we're talking about managing your research data, it's the digital data that you're generating that we're thinking of. Some of you may be working with physical samples, but from the perspective of data management, we're really thinking about the digital data that you're generating. Other than your scientific publications, so your publications are kind of the output of the research process. I want you to think about what are the inputs into that process. So what do you use as evidence? So thinking again as your publication as the output, what evidence are you basing your conclusions on and your findings on? And what would you need to give to somebody else in order to validate the research findings and results that you're writing about in your publications? So bearing that in mind, so what do you use as evidence and what is accepted within your discipline as necessary to validate research findings and results? In about 2 or 3 words, just pop into the chat what you consider your research data to be. So thinking about what you use as evidence, what you are relying on as evidence, and what you might need to provide somebody else to validate the research findings and results. So interviews and transcripts, DNA sequences, field results, image files, simulation input files and output files, survey data and Excel, pictures and drawings, absolutely, Martina. Those are 100% data. If you are relying on them as evidence, then they are absolutely part of your data set. Field results, more survey data, lots of Excel spreadsheets, but also physical data collected, or physical data collection forms. So more transcripts, more Excel data, some recordings. Great, so it's good to see that most of you seem to have an idea of how this definition applies to your research and the data that you're collecting, because I think that's kind of a helpful starting point. So what is a data management plan? Because that's what I'm really going to be talking to you about this morning, or this afternoon, I should say. A data management plan, or a DMP, is a formal document that outlines how data is to be handled both during a research project and then after the project is completed. So this is a document that you're going to create, ideally at the beginning of the research project, and it's going to answer a bunch of questions about how you plan on managing your research data during the project and how you plan on sharing those data at the end of the project. Why am I asking you to do this? Your funders may also be asking you to write a data management plan, depending on who you are funded by. And if you are applying for funding in the future, you will almost certainly have to address data management in the funding application form. So within funding application forms, they generally ask for between a couple of 100 words to 2 pages of a data management plan. Depending on the complexity of the project that you're working on, a completed data management plan can be a couple of pages long, up to 30, 40, 50 pages long, if you're talking about a very large, complex, multinational project. So why are your funders asking you to do it? Why am I recommending that you do it? Really, we want to think about how to make your data fair, and I'm going to talk specifically about fair in a minute. So we need to get you thinking about this from the beginning of the research project. Depending on the size of the group that you're working in, it may just be yourself and your PI, but you may be working with other researchers. We want to create awareness and agreement on procedures within the research group. And again, that becomes more important with the larger research projects. We want to help researchers think about what they're doing at an early stage so that they can make intelligent choices for their data. And you'll see as I talk through some of the options that really the earlier you start to think about some of these questions, the better. For example, those of you who are doing interviews or who are working with personal data, you need to consider how you're going to share those data at the end of the research project, and make sure that you're gaining consent to do that as you're generating your participants and including that on your consent form and your information sheets. So it's very important to think about these things at the very beginning. It's much more difficult to retrospectively get consent to do these things or to generate documentation or metadata. It's much easier to do it as you're going along. And by being in control of your own data management, the research gets better and more efficient. Just to give you a bit of policy context within UCD, we do have an RDM policy. So RDM stands for Research Data Management. The policy is available on the website, and there's a link there to it in the slides. You should have received a copy of the slides with the 2 reminder emails, but I'll send out another copy just to be sure. But the UCD RDM policy says that UCD recognises that the management of research data is fundamental to both high quality research and to academic integrity. Accurate and retrievable research data is an essential component of any research project and is necessary to verify and defend the process and outcomes of research. So you can see a comparison there and a parallel between the definition that I showed at the beginning and UCD recognising the importance of these data. The research integrity policy also refers to data management. So serious or repeated instances of unacceptable practices can constitute research misconduct. data related practices, so not preserving your permanent data, poor data management or storage, are included as examples of unacceptable practices, and therefore can constitute research misconduct. So I mentioned that I was going to talk about fair data very briefly. This is a set of principles that were agreed in 2016. They were agreed by funders and researchers, research support staff like myself, and in libraries all across Europe and across the world. There are a set of principles that describe the attributes data need to have in order to enable and enhance reuse by humans and by machines. So FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. In some ways, making your data fair is a partnership between yourself and the archive. So there are some responsibilities that you as the researcher will have in making sure that your data are fair. And part of that includes choosing a repository that will support that. And most data archives and repositories now are very much working towards making data fair or as fair as possible. The reason I bring it up is because a lot of the funders are referring to fair data in their policies and also in their funding applications. So if this is something that you see in a funding application in the future, you can go, oh yeah, I've heard of that before. I have a vague idea of what it's about. And then you can come back and email me and tell me, remind me what that thing was about fair data. So data should be findable, they should be accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And when it comes to making your data fair, these are kind of the very basic steps, first steps that you can take towards making your data as fair as possible. So make the data available in a data archive or repository. Add rich metadata to those data, so describe them in as much detail as you possibly can, and add a clear license to those data. So a license will tell other researchers and other members of the public what they can and can't do with those data. Most archives will have kind of standard licenses that they will apply, or they will give you a selection of licenses and you can choose which license you would like to apply to your data. So by making the data available in the archive repository and considering a persistent identifier, which the archive will provide, you provide as much metadata and documentation as you can and a clear license, you're well on your way to making your data fair. So these are kind of the questions that you want to be thinking about answering within your funding application. So I'm going to go very quickly through these 10 simple rules for creating a good data management plan. And 3 of them I have picked out to talk in a little bit more detail. I'll go through those 3 specific tips in future slides. So the first one is to determine the research sponsor requirements. So does your funder have a template that they would like you to use for creating a data management plan? Most of them within Ireland don't as yet, apart from the HRB, have a specific template that they would like to use. However, the HRB's Health Research Board, their template is based on Science Europe guidelines, which are the same guidelines that UCD Library's checklist is based on. So there's a direct comparison between their template and our template, which hopefully will make life a little bit easier for you. If you are writing a funding application, just be aware of the specific questions that the funder is asking you to address and make sure that you're answering those questions. Identify the data to be collected. Within our checklist, I give you a table that can be quite useful to start thinking about what are the different data sets that you're going to be collecting. This can be a really useful inventory for you of all the data sets that you're generating as you go through your PhD. Obviously within your Viva, you're going to be asked to defend your results, and obviously your data are integral to this. So by identifying what all the different data sets are within your data management plan, this will be a useful tool to you when it comes to preparing for your Viva. Define how the data will be organized. So you want to think about a file naming structure so that you would apply a consistent file naming structure across all of your files. And on our library LibGuide, we have some examples of how you can do that. You also want to think about how you are organizing the data in terms of the folder structure that you're going to be using. And again, on our website, we have some examples of how you can do that. Really what you want to do is give a folder structure and a file naming convention that makes sense to you, so that at a glance, you kind of you've a rough idea about what's in that specific file, rather than just saying data .xl, that it gives you some clue about what's actually in that particular file, or that where you can find your particular data files. The folder structure should make sense to you and potentially to other people as well who might be using it. And you also want to think about then version control. So that's the third part of defining how the data will be organized. So having some kind of version control in place. Describe how data quality will be assured. This varies completely from discipline to discipline, but in most disciplines, there are kind of standard procedures in how you would verify the quality of the data that you're generating as you go along, whether that's having a control group, whether that's having somebody else check your transcriptions, whether that's running statistics to make sure that there are no outliers, or running extra samples, calibrating machinery. That will very much depend on the type of research that you're doing. But however that you're doing that, just note that down in your data management plan. And that speaks very much to the integrity of the data that you're producing and the quality of the data as well. You want to think about the project's data policies. So within your data management plan, you can refer to things like the UCD or RDM policy. We have other policies in UCD that are also useful to point to, including, for example, the password protection policy. We have ethics policies and data protection policies as well, that may be relevant to your research. And again, you can just keep a note of the relevant policies and keep track of what you need to be putting in place to make sure that your data are safe and secure and of good quality. And this can obviously be depending on the size of the project. Then if you're working in a very big research group, the project's data policies are going to be much more complex. But it just means that everybody's on the same page and is generating and documenting data in the same way. You want to think about assigning roles and responsibilities. For most of you, you're probably working on solo projects. So you are responsible for the data management, for making sure that there's a backup in place, for making sure that quality control measures are in place, that the data management plan is up to date. But in a bigger research project, those roles and responsibilities might be broken down a little bit more. And it's useful to actually put a name beside some of these things so that everybody within the research project is aware of who is responsible for what. And then finally, to prepare a realistic budget. And this really applies when applying for funding, that you need to think about any materials that you might need to buy or any consumables. So do you need extra storage space that you need to purchase? Does the repository that you want to archive your data with have a cost associated with it? Do you need to buy encrypted voice recorders, for example? Do you need to buy a new digital camera so that you can take the highest quality images? So all of these things that are costs which are generally allowable, but only if you include them at the very beginning when you're actually applying for the funding. It's much more difficult to get these costs retrospectively. Again, another good reason why it's important to think about these things at the very beginning. So I'm just going to move on. So I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about how data should be documented. This is one of the sections of the data management plan. So good quality documentation will allow others to find and understand your data, but particularly in the case of a PhD, it will help you to find and understand your data, so that in 3 years' time, when it comes to defending your PhD and your Viva, that you have good quality documentation which allows you to get up to speed and to remember what you did in the first year of your PhD, that you're not forgetting anything by the time it comes to actually writing it all up. Examples of documentation that you might want to consider including include your interview protocol, questionnaires and any interviewer instructions that you might be including, a code book or a data dictionary if you're working with tabular data. So for example, Excel or SPSS, a code book or data dictionary will explain what all of your variable names mean, what all of the variable labels are, what all of the value labels are, as you are going through the process of creating your Excel spreadsheet or your SPSS file. If you're working with human participants, keeping a copy of your information sheet, obviously a blank consent form, you wouldn't make the signed consent forms available, and ethical approval that you've also gotten. And this can be quite useful for people who are looking to potentially reuse your data, that they understand what consents were put in place at the very beginning. If you are working with databases, you might include a database schema that might include some information about why certain decisions were made, why things were done in a specific way. Any methodology reports that you generate as you're going through your research as well can be incredibly useful to point to. And then if you're using existing research data, so if you're using data from an archive or an existing repository, keeping provenance information about those sources of data. So provenance information means where did they come from? So keeping a really clear record of where you found all of the images that you're now relying on, or the sound clips, or whatever it is. If you're using somebody else's data or sources of derived data or existing data sets, making sure that you're keeping a really clear record of where all of that information came from. That will just help somebody to kind of step back through your thought process, and will help you to defend and verify the findings that you're writing about in your publications. You want to think about providing a strategy for short-term data storage as well as long-term data archiving. So I'm going to talk about the short-term storage in the first place. Within UCD, we have a relatively new file storage and sharing guide. So Dermot or Vanessa, you might just pop the link to that into the chat. The link is also within the slides as well, so you will be able to go back and find it again. The storage and sharing guide recommends the use of Google Drive, your UCD Google Drive, not obviously your personal Google Drive, for storing research data. There have been changes that have been made to the legal agreements between UCD and Google, and security updates as well for including the use of multi-factor authentication for staff, which means that Google Drive is now much more secure than it would have previously been. So it is now suitable to keep personal data within Google Drive, which is great news because previously it was much more challenging to deal with personal research data or data about humans or actual people. So that's quite useful. We do also have access to Microsoft OneDrive, but Google Drive is the preferred place for keeping your research data. Google Drive also has really nice sharing facilities so that you can share specific files with specific people, but you don't have to share other files that you might want to restrict access to. It's possible to do that. It's possible to audit who has access to specific files, and who has accessed those files as well. So really it's the kind of the optimal place to keep your research data. But as I said, the file storage and sharing guide is there. Again, this is something that you want to point to within your data management plan to say, I am making these decisions about where I'm going to store my data based on the UCD file storage and sharing guide provided by IT services. And then any funder who's looking at this to evaluate the quality of the data management plan can see why you're making the decisions that you've made. Then the last thing that I'm going to go through in a lot of detail today is to describe how the data will be disseminated. So I've already talked about how to make your data fair, you really want to make your data available in an archive or repository. The funders are now beginning to require more and more that you make your underlying data available. So this is both for reproducibility purposes and replicability of your research, but also for research reuse by other researchers. So the funders are looking at this from I suppose, a cost benefit perspective, that if they are putting millions of euro into generating specific data sets, they only want to have to do that once and then make those data available for other researchers to reuse. You would also want to make your data available so that you can stand over the quality of your work and say, well, the data are available, I've provided all the documentation and the methodology, and you can have a look at the decisions that I made and how I came to those conclusions, and therefore I can stand over what I'm publishing about. So really, when it comes to sharing the data and making it fair, so again, findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable, it's about the quality of the research and being able to stand over the quality of the research that you're providing and producing in terms of reproducibility, but also reuse by other people for other research purposes. And of course, you as a researcher will also benefit from the research data that has already been made available in these archives and repositories, so that you might be able to go and have a look at other data sets which are relevant to the research that you're doing. And so you could use those within your own research as well. A lot of journal publishers are also now requiring that you make the data set available underlying the publications. And again, this comes down to reproducibility, that they feel more confident in standing over the results that they're publishing in their journals if the data are also being made available. So the UCD policy recommends that you make your data available. Your funder may have mandates in terms of making your data available. And then the journal that you choose may also have mandates or recommendations around making those data available. And so really, to get you thinking about this from the beginning of your PhD or the next research project that you're working on, to make sure that you have relevant consent in place, that you're generating the documentation that you might also need to provide with the data as you're going along. So when it comes to choosing an archive or repository, ideally you want to choose a discipline-specific repository or archive if one exists for your discipline. And on our website, we have links to places where you can have a look to see if there are relevant discipline repositories for your discipline. So the reason for this is that they may have discipline-specific standards that they recommend you use in terms of file formats or the documentation that you provide, or even the standards that you use and you apply to your data as you're generating it. Your data are more findable if they are stored with data of similar types. So if you are researching archaeology and you're going to an archaeological database, you are much more likely to come across somebody else's data relevant to archaeology than if they put it, in just some random place on the internet. So choose a discipline-specific repository where possible. It makes your data more findable, and it ticks a lot of the boxes in terms of making your data fair. And they will also have recommendations on the file formats and the standards that you should be applying to your data. A disciplinary specific repository will also have expertise in managing your specific type of data, so that if the data needs to be migrated in the future, that archive or repository is best placed to do that and make sure that your data may remain accessible into the long term. If no disciplinary repository or archive exists, you can, and for a lot of disciplines they don't, you can consider depositing data in a multidisciplinary repository. And again, there are a number of different examples that we talk about on our website. No one of them is specifically better or worse than any other. The one that I tend to use or tend to talk about most is Zenodo. That's Zenodo. And really the reason for that is that it has some nice links back to the EU. So if you're receiving funding through the EU, there are nice reporting lines back to that. It's funded by the European Union, by the European Commission, and it's based at CERN. So you can be fairly confident that they probably have pretty good backup procedures in place, and that your data are not going to disappear overnight anytime soon. So that's one option in terms of the multidisciplinary repositories. So I just want to show you very quickly, when it comes to writing your data management plan, in November of last year, we launched a new tool within UCD, which is DMP Online at UCD. The URL for that is dmp.ucd.ie. Again, that's on the slides, but Vanessa or Dermot, you might just pop that into the chat, please. So you can go to dmp.ucd.ie. You can log in using your single sign-on, your UCD single sign-on. So you don't need to create a new account. It will automatically log you in. If you're using multi-factor authentication, you might need to authenticate, but other than that, it should be a relatively straightforward way to get through to create your DMP. So one of the features that I just want to draw your attention to, so as well as writing your plan, and I'm going to talk through the guidance that we have, the tailored guidance for UCD researchers that we have available to you. But we also have this ability for you to request feedback from me. So if you're stuck with something, or you just want to make sure you're on the right track, or there's one particular question you're not sure how to answer for your research project, at any point you can request feedback. So when you click on that button, it will send me an email to let me know that there's a data management plan that somebody would like some help with. I can then add comments to that data management plan, and then there's a button that I'll click when I'm ready to send that feedback back to you. So that's all contained within the DMP Online tool. So once you log back in, you'll be able to see the comments that I have left for you. I will always, on a full data management plan review, offer to meet with the researchers, so either in person or over Zoom, whatever your preference is, to talk through any of the questions that they might, that there might be concerns over or confusion over, so that you can ask me any questions that you might have. And I find it sometimes it's much easier to talk these issues through and to kind of tease things out than it is just reviewing a text data management plan. So that service is available to you. Please use it. There's a lot of guidance that we do provide within our UCD data management checklist. So the data management checklist is divided into 6 different sections. And for each of the questions within those sections, we have a lot of detailed guidance, so relevant definitions, points to consider when you're completing the data management plan, the relevant UCD policies that you want to take into account, any procedures that exist within UCD, any additional resources that might be available to you. If there's any specific UCD guidance or suggested text, I've also included that there as well. And so this is tailored specifically for you guys as researchers within UCD to help you complete your data management plan. But as I said, it's very difficult with kind of a generic template to provide disciplinary guidance. So you might find that there's something that you just need a little bit more support or help with. And in that case, get in touch with me and I'll do the absolute best that I can to help you with that. So just a very quick recap before we head to the questions. So if anybody has questions, you can get typing in the chat, or you can get ready to unmute yourself. So just to recap, so organize. I mean, there's probably so much about your research project that you're already organizing, and this is certainly very true for me. If you make a plan, you might just follow it. I have a notebook in which everything gets written down, because otherwise it's going to go straight back out of my head again. So by having a plan in place, you might just follow it. Document as you're going along. So what would my colleagues need to know and to understand this data? What will I need to know in 3 years' time? What will I need to remember about the decisions I made as I was generating the data? Store your data in a suitable location. And again, we have this new file storage and sharing guide. So just familiarize yourself with it. And make sure you're storing your data appropriately, particularly if you're working with any human participant data or any personal data or any kind of sensitive data. Make sure you're storing that and backing it up appropriately. And then share the data at the end of the research project. So data makes an impact to you as a researcher. It can help to raise your profile. or the profile of your research group, and it also helps society. I think one of the things to come out of the current pandemic, which hopefully we're getting towards the end of, but you know, the genome for the COVID-19 virus was made available to researchers very, very quickly, and that was shared globally. I think we can all see the value in making the research data underlying a lot of the research that has been carried out about COVID, making the data themselves available to both the public and to other scientists for interrogation, so that we know that we put, our governments were relying on good quality scientific information and advice, and that we were putting, hopefully the best restrictions in place to keep the maximum number of people safe and healthy. And that by making the data available when it came to vaccines, that we were able to scrutinize those as well, and make sure that everything was going to be as safe as possible for us. So I think this has provided a really good example for me to be able to hopefully convince you that making your data available will make an impact to you, as well as potentially to society as well. So just the last thing is for me to say thank you very much for listening. I appreciate that data management for people who aren't me can be a really boring topic. So hopefully you learned something from that. You have my email address there, so absolutely feel free to get in touch with me if there's anything I can help you with. We have a library guide to data management as well, which contains links to absolutely everything that I've referred to this afternoon. So I'm going to stop talking now. If you want to pop a question into the chat, feel free to do that. If you're comfortable, you can put on your microphone and your video. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop recording now at this point.